Vice President Kamala Harris is visiting Detroit Tuesday. Malachi, what are Detroiters saying about Harris's bid for the White House?
Yeah, so I'm based here in Detroit. I'm part of the Bridge Detroit newsroom. And it's really interesting how Harris is barnstorming Michigan now. She's coming to Detroit twice, Tuesday for a radio interview with the Breakfast Club. And then she's going to be back on Saturday to kind of commemorate the start of early in person voting in the city. We have early voting centers that are going to be opening up on Saturday. And there's a lot of like events and activations happening around that. And then Obama is coming as well later in the month, 2 weeks before Election Day. I've been talking with some folks over the weekend about this, and for them, it kind of signals a course correction. For months, we had kind of heard from community leaders that were making comparisons to that Democratic nightmare of 2016, the kind of feeling that voters are being taken for granted, particularly the base of the party, Black voters here in Detroit. And I was texting with a Democratic official this morning who said that the campaign was telling surrogates they may not actually even come back in October. Harris herself wouldn't come back to Detroit in October, um, and that has changed. I mean, they're really putting a lot more emphasis on Black voters. They released a economic agenda for Black men, and there seems to be a particular battle for Black men. Some polling over the summer and into the fall had suggested that support for Harris had lagged behind Biden in 2020. I think that's part of why you're seeing her go on the Breakfast Club. She's been showing up on some other kind of podcast alternative shows like the Shade Room. Um, so yeah, I mean, I think voters, are enthusiastic to support her here in Detroit. I think there are some folks who feel a little miffed by the campaign's focus on Republicans, who may not love Donald Trump and undecided voters, whoever that may be at this point in the race. But the campaign seems to have heard that concern and have, shifted their attention back to the city with a couple of weeks left to go here.
And they just released that ad over the weekend as well about, they should be so lucky to be like Detroit. That is a play on something that former President Donald Trump said last week at a Detroit event. Simon, can you talk about what Trump said at that event and how Detroiters responded to that event?
Yeah, absolutely. So this was a speech and address he gave at a gathering of the Detroit Economic Club, where Trump said the whole country will be like Detroit if she's your president, referring to Democratic nominee Kamala Harris. And I think there was little reaction in the room to the statement in the moment, but Democrats and some Detroiters, as well as some Detroit politicians, made hay with this. They went and said, he obviously Trump was casting this as a negative thing, that this idea that Detroit, which he described in 2020 as like living in hell, that that whatever fate Detroit is experiencing, that the rest of the country will experience it if Kamala Harris is president. But Detroiters, boosters of the city, are seeing the city in recent years in a very different light. They're seeing, increasing employment in the city, raising wages, rising home values. It's reversing decades-long trends of decline in Detroit that, more than a decade after the city's bankruptcy is finally seeing some reversals on. And so, this we had less than 24 hours later, we had a ad come out from Harris's campaign, really emphasizing that, they should be, with a profanity, they should be so lucky to be like Detroit, if Kamala Harris is president, which is why you should vote for her. And I think also that this is sort of illustrating the two sides of Donald Trump that we see on the campaign trail. Even while the Trump campaign is actively trying to make inroads to Black male voters, a crucial population in Detroit and a crucial source of votes for the former president, you also, and hoping that he's going to take sort of more strategic, targeted attack in his rhetoric. Instead, you have this version of Donald Trump that also likes to riff off the cuff. The guy who talked about in 2016 or 2017, rather, in his inauguration speech about, like carnage and urban decay in the United States and him reversing that. I think a lot of his still personal viewpoint of the city is through that lens. And you're seeing that reflected in some of his more off the cuff remarks. This was an ad-libbed phrase. It wasn't included in his prepared remarks. But still, it's something that really resonated. And as Democrats are really trying to, as Malachi noted, make this course correction, this sort of adds a little fuel to their fire. And they're hoping that they can seize upon this and say, here's how Donald Trump really feels about Detroit. Even as he's courting you, maybe he kind of looks down upon the city as well.
How important, Malachi and Simon, how important is Detroit in this election?
Yeah, I mean, it's really important for Democrats in particular. They need turnout to be high in the city. I mean, we've talked about this a lot this year, but just the way that the math works, in high turnout elections, Democrats have a much easier chance of taking the state. We're a battleground state. We're very important to the calculus of the electoral college vote with what it takes to become president. And Republicans have been more open about their efforts to come to the city and try to peel off disaffected voters, try to appeal to Black men. JD Vance was in Eastern Market last week speaking to, I should note, a mostly white audience, some folks even who had never really been to Eastern Market before. But the chair of the Michigan Republican Party said that, we are actively here in Detroit. We're trying to peel off voters. They've been doing the same in communities kind of connected to the city, like Hamtramck and Dearborn as well. But it was funny. I mean, like the Trump remarks, it was almost like that scene in Avengers with the portals opening. It was like everybody immediately came to like the defense of the city. The mayor had a statement out on social media, like, within a couple of hours. People were like, hey, back off the city. People were very prideful. Tigers were in the playoffs last week. Unfortunately, they lost on Saturday, so that was a bummer. But then the Lions delivered a whooping to the Cowboys on Sunday. So there's a lot of pride in the city, beyond kind of the people who live here too. So it was a weird battle for him to pick there. But in terms of like, the overall calculus, I mean, it's pretty simple. Like the Republicans feel that every voter that they can turn, even if they only get a small percentage of the votes in the city, is going to have a pretty, magnifying effect for the statewide results.
Yeah, and I think that just to add on to that briefly, I think that the messaging that you see, we overuse a lot of the times the word microcosm when talking about Michigan elections, but the economic trajectory that Detroit has seen over the President Joe Biden's first term has really played out for these residents. We've seen this huge urban revival and economic, a ton of investment pouring into the city, but it's also not touching all residents of the city. Not everybody's feeling materially that resurgence, right? And so when you hear narratives that are competing between Trump and Harris's campaign about the economy, how folks are doing, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? I think that that's also playing out in Detroit. And as they contest for these Detroit voters, you're going to see sort of these two depictions of the economy and how people's financial fortunes are doing at play a lot too.
And people in the city are quick to point out the challenges and the things that still need to happen here. I mean, it's not like we're ignorant to the high level of crime and some of the other things that folks were kind of pointing out on social media. As a backlash to Democrats saying, well, everyone should be more like Detroit. Detroit's great. A lot of folks were also saying, well, you guys have a lot of problems as a city that still need to be overcome. And that's true. I mean, you go across the city, you talk to Democrats, you talk to Republicans in the city, people are aware that there are challenges here. But in terms of like the image of the city, it's like I think that's why you saw such a quick kind of reaction to this. I mean, people are defensive of Detroit, especially on the national stage. New York Times came to the city over the weekend, did a kind of a tour with Mayor Duggan in a story that ran, I think, on Sunday. That was kind of like a counter narrative to all of the. It was basically kind of walking through all of the things that have happened. NFL draft, the Michigan Central Station coming back, all that economic progress with property values. So it's a nuanced conversation. I think it's a lot more than just Detroit good, Detroit bad.